I'd like now to introduce Dr. Cheryl Teelucksingh, who we have been privileged to be working with in the last number of years. She's an associate professor at Ryerson University in the sociology department. She's also the principal investigator of the Green Gap Research Project, which is funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the Metcalfe Foundation. This study engages with the need to understand shared and conflicting meanings about green jobs as the green economy is emerging. So please welcome Cheryl.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. I'm going to be co-presenting today with Laura Zeglen, so I'm going to start off by sort of framing the materials. And as Carolyn said, we started to work on this project as part of a broader sort of Green Gap project. So I would like to sort of recognize the rest of the members of my team, and this is actually one of the rare occasions where we're actually all in the same room, so also here and part of the broader project that fed into the Metcalfe paper is Dr. Poland, Dr. Galabozzi, and Dr. Egan. So part of the reason why we're meeting here today on Leap Day is to sort of pick up off of the COP21 meeting that John was just referring to. And at that point, we were fortunate that there was a renewed sort of commitment to fight climate change. In Ontario, we've taken on a fairly ambitious goal, saying by 2020, which is actually not that far off from now, that we are going to aim to reduce carbon emissions to 15% below our 1990 levels. Now, what happened as part of the team that went to Paris is that they said there were two things that were missing from the agreement that Canadians wanted, and particularly in terms of Canadian labor and equity groups. And they said that it was important, as John talked about, to highlight the needs of equity groups, particularly Indigenous people and racialized groups, and the need for the just transition. So keeping in mind those themes, the paper that Laura and I put together as part of the Green Gap project for the Metcalfe Foundation was to look for and argue for the need for a shift to an inclusive green economy. So this diagram gives you a sense of some of the components that we thought were key to an inclusive green economy. So we're looking at environmental sustainability, we're looking to have a strong labor market, as well as to add to that the social inclusion and the equity piece. Now, what has happened sort of historically is all of these things have been discussed separately, right? And they've involved separate policies and separate social movements. Now, in terms of envisioning how they all come together, at the center we've positioned the need for decent green jobs. So when we talk about decent jobs, we're talking about the things that we all want in the workplace. And some of these components involve things such as remuneration. But here we're sort of focusing on the equity groups, and I've listed a few of them in terms of women, racialized groups, and Indigenous people. But we're also looking to change the labor market in the sense of moving away from precarious work, the emphasis on contracts, and to make employers responsible for the equity pieces and the move away from precarious work. We're also sort of hoping that the decent work will continue and push for more unionized representation, particularly since unionized representation in the past has been key to ensuring that the equity groups are represented in the workplace. Now, in terms of what decent jobs will look like in the green economy, some of them are going to be jobs of which have already existed. And then others are going to be jobs by which the new sort of green component is a new sort of way of looking at the labor market. So we've included some examples here. And as has been mentioned, construction is a very sort of key area where, particularly if we see construction attached to green buildings or green infrastructure, then we can start to think about it as being green jobs. The food sector, if that is connected again to sort of more local initiatives and sustainability, then that's an example. Some examples of new emerging sectors across and focusing on energy, because renewable energy is one sector that is key here in Toronto, energy efficient managers or entrepreneurs. What we've examined through looking at the research and echoed by other players such as Eco Canada is that these jobs are going to be a range of jobs, professional, administrative, and technical jobs. And they will be focused in Toronto primarily around sort of green buildings and green infrastructure. Now, what is sort of key to this move towards an inclusive green economy is to make sure that it is just. And as John was just sort of highlighting, a just transition involves recognizing that climate change itself is a problem, is eliminating particular types of jobs. Neoliberalism and deindustrialization has accounted for other sorts of changes in our workplace. So the needs of specific groups that are key in terms of moving towards a just, inclusive green economy is looking at the position of displaced workers, students and younger workers who are looking to get into the economy in the first place, as well as racialized inequity groups. And this requires particular types of support, right? Support that is either going to come from different types of stakeholders or to come from the government to ensure that there's compensation as people are displaced and mechanisms throughout the training and reemployment to ensure that they're able to move into the economy. Now, the research done by colleagues such as Dr. Galabozzi and others have highlighted the fact that Toronto's labor force, besides the fact that we have high representations of racialized workers and people struggling in the workplace, includes issues connected to precarity, as well as interesting tensions where there's a high emphasis on credentialism, but difficulties for people to access the credentials that they require in the workplace. And racialized workers are more likely to be in positions of systemic exclusion, both in the labor markets and in other institutions. Now, as a fortunate announcement just recently, our Premier Catherine Wynne announced the fact that there is a new anti-racism directorate that's going to be announced. So that's a positive initiative that has taken place in the last little while. Now, in terms of attempting to sort of bring together all the decent work and the concerns for equity that we've been talking about, we put together a framework to look at 3 different types of tools. And in terms of the way that they're presented in this diagram, it's important to see this as a system, whereby in the paper to Metcalfe, we weren't advocating any particular strategy in and of itself, but to talk about them as being parts that must function together. And so what happens then is employment equity on the outer ring is something that we're all familiar with, and then the first piece that in terms of the first tool that I'm going to talk about. Employment equity we're all familiar with as being a government policy, right? And the government policy that was required simply because if we left it to the marketplace and the free market, equity groups were not being represented. But another side of talking about employment equity is that much like multiculturalism, most people in Toronto value employment equity within the workplace. And they see that as something that we should be pursuing. So one of the things that we considered in the paper is the fact that employment equity as a shared value hasn't been harnessed to the extent that it should be. Now, in terms of looking at employment equity, there's very little literature that looks at using the existing framework of employment equity that we have here in Canada and merging that into the green economy. And then studies done by the Environment Career Organization has shown that if we take a look at who's actually getting green jobs right now, there is very little representation of equity groups, whether or not they be women, minorities, or racialized people. And this is not surprisingly mirroring the representation of racialized and equity groups in the environmental movement itself and in environmental organizations. So in terms of bringing an equity approach, the environmental sector really, and the green sector, really needs to be responsive to a broader range of people. Now, the caveat is that employment equity is a policy that is really only mandated to protect government workers and their contracts. The vast majority of green sector jobs are actually in the private sector. So bringing and introducing in employment equity into the private sector is tricky. So what we're sort of suggesting is that a lot has to happen because this requires an intervention, right? It requires changing the way by which standard business practices actually function in order to bring equity into the workplace. And in terms of bringing equity, we're suggesting that this should not just be a front-end initiative, but in terms of beyond hiring, equity should be a means for upward mobility in terms of training, so that equity groups can move into decision-making roles and start impacting the messages, the products, and the direction of organizations. In terms of indirect measures, obviously this has consequences for people's sense of belonging within Canada, contributing to the economy and the full use of their training and their skills. So we've had to also sort of consider some recommendations. And some of these recommendations have required us to recognize that employment equity isn't necessarily going to be something, and this is what distinguishes our approach to it to our neighbors to the south. We don't focus simply on numbers, but we recognize that equity is about examining historical power inequalities, right? And recognizing that all the way through organizations and decision making, this has to be implemented. And the green sector really has to sort of do some difficult work and think about picking up the tools to do equity in a very sort of systemic way. The next thing in terms of implementing employment equity is reaching out to racialized and marginalized groups. And this involves changing recruitment strategies and going to where equity groups are located themselves, rather than sort of saying nobody's actually showing up to these meetings or these green sector meetings. There doesn't seem to be an interest in environmental issues in equity groups. Perhaps they're not interested in these jobs. So changing the methods of outreach. And this is going to require the green businesses to realign how they're structured and to sort of think about embracing other sorts of frameworks. The second tool that we're taking a look at is community benefits agreements. And we've already got a little bit of an introduction to that from John, but Laura is going to pick up on talking about community benefits agreements in the second tool.
All right, Laura Zeglen is the project coordinator for the Green Gap project. She has played a central role in this research that demonstrates how a green economy and social equity can and should be interconnected. Outside of the world of work, she's been a vocal advocate for community engagement in the process of transit planning. As chair of the grassroots group Options for Davenport and West Toronto, that's where you did it, right? She now works as a school travel planning facilitator at Green Communities Canada. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks Cheryl for getting us started. So I'm going to take us through the final two of our three tools. So I'll be starting with community benefits agreements, and I'm really happy that we have Prince and Nameen here, who are also going to speak a bit more to Toronto example of community benefits agreement. Well, it's actually a community benefits framework, which they would like to be a community benefits agreement. I'll just spend a little bit of time sort of outlining what a community benefits agreement actually is. So in terms of just sort of a general description of what it is, it's an inclusive, collaborative, and accountable process between a community and other project stakeholders. So that term process is really quite important in this definition, because it's not just about somebody coming forward with solutions for a community. We're going to tell you how we're going to fix your situation in your community. It's about working together with different stakeholders, including community groups, to come up with what the benefits are that they actually want to see. It's a signed and legally enforceable agreement between different stakeholders. So generally, it is between community groups and a private stakeholder, such as a builder who's making a building or creating a piece of transit infrastructure. But in the case of publicly funded projects, it also includes government as a stakeholder as well. It details in writing the specific benefits that a community will receive from a given development project. So these benefits might include, and it varies depending on the community and what that community decides that they want to see through the project, but it can include equitable hiring practices as part of the agreement, funding for training, neighborhood improvements, and support for social enterprises. So particularly with those first two pieces, so Rajan spoke to this a little bit in his talk, how important it is that we're not just providing opportunities for jobs, but also the training and access to those jobs for marginalized communities who might be interested but perhaps don't have the credentials needed or need the support to get the proper training so that they can actually move into those jobs that are becoming available in their communities. It's very important as well that there's a substantial community involvement in all phases of a CBA. So it's not just at the start or at the end. They're intimately involved throughout the process to make sure that there's good communication and that the community is also benefiting from whatever is being planned. So in terms of the benefits here, there's quite a few in terms of access to green jobs is an obvious one, skill building opportunities. These need to be built into the process itself to be actually recognized. Furthermore, there's reinvestment in marginalized communities. So when we're talking about things like the Eglinton Crosstown, there's opportunities for actually developing better infrastructure in marginalized communities in Toronto. So above and beyond the fact that people might benefit from the jobs related to building of the Crosstown line, and not just construction, but also professional, administrative, and technical jobs, we're also looking at what the long-term benefits of the community could be once that infrastructure is complete, including better connectivity and accessibility for residents in the neighborhood. But we've also got indirectly measurable benefits such as deliberative democracy, so promoting grassroots decision-making and participation. So again, that goes back to the importance of this being about the process. It's not just about bringing solutions to the communities, it's about the communities being an integral part of coming up with those solutions. Also balancing out the role of the private sector. So generally in major infrastructure projects, we're not talking, the community might have a role in terms of, they have some groups where they're talking about what would you like to see, but it's kind of a peripheral part of the process. It's not really central to deciding what's being built and how. So this is an important piece that it balances out the power of the private sector in making these decisions, that the community can actually be a meaningful partner. And then relatedly, building better partnerships between different sectors who maybe don't normally work together and don't normally consider each other's needs as they're deciding what it is that they want to do. So these recommendations will make a lot more sense within the paper itself when you get to read the actual description and discussion. But in particular, I just wanted to focus on the second one of providing support mechanisms for local communities to facilitate these legally binding CBAs. As you were listening to this, some of you might have picked up on, obviously there's power imbalances between community groups and a large developer. How do we expect community groups to be able to actually be a meaningful partner in any sort of deliberation? They don't have the resources, they don't have the expertise. So a really important part of what we're recommending in terms of CBAs is that support is provided to community groups. They're not expected to just go out and do it on their own. Okay, so we'll move into our third and final tool, which is social enterprises. So social enterprises have been variously defined. For our purposes, we're looking at social enterprises as a nonprofit organization that employs business methods and practices to create training opportunities and employment for low-income and marginalized individuals. So we're looking specifically at social enterprises that have an employment focus on them. The social enterprises occupy this kind of funny space between the public and not-for-profit sector and the private sector, supposedly, and if they're done well, harnessing the strengths of both. And they're driven by a social and or environmental mission, and also working towards the goal of making a profit. So the profit is how they sustain themselves, but it's not the driving mission for why they exist in the first place. And it's important to note as well that social enterprises are not suggested as a replacement for government supports, but as a complement to them. So some of the benefits of social enterprises, they're very similar, again, to community benefits agreements. And in fact, sometimes social enterprises are actually part of community benefits agreements. So communities might decide along with the developer that, we want part of whatever you build that you're going to work with local social enterprises. So they're going to be part of the people who are going to be providing services for your construction crew. They're going to be people who are going to be providing the materials that you need for what you're building. So actually supporting local businesses at the same time that you're building up the community with whatever development happens to be in place. So it brings economic activity that can hopefully be long-lasting beyond just the time frame of whatever is being built. In terms of more indirectly measurable benefits, greener consumption is one. So for example, if there are green social enterprises in a neighborhood offering green products and services to people, they now have the opportunity that they can participate in supporting that business, and they have that option of what they can spend their money on. And also if they're being employed in the social enterprise, they've also got additional income to support that. So we've got one example of a green social enterprise in Toronto that's particularly noteworthy. It's called Turnaround Couriers. So they provide services to high-profile clients in downtown Toronto. So in terms of the business model piece, they've done a good job in picking out a form of support that's can afford to pay for their services, and they've been in business for quite a while, so obviously it's working out for them. But they exclusively recruit at-risk youth for all of their bicycle courier positions and back office staff. So that doesn't mean that at-risk youth can't move into other positions or can't apply for other positions, but those positions are specifically reserved for at-risk youth as a way to give them an entry into the social enterprise. And it provides young people an opportunity to gain valuable work experience and also some income, as well as build confidence towards successful employment in the future. An interesting twist is that all the couriers are given a bike on a rent-to-own basis, so they can use it for work, for doing their deliveries, but also for their own sustainable form of transportation getting around town. And they can keep the bike at the end of it once they've paid it off. And it contributes to funding its employees. So this is a newer thing that they've done, contributing to funding their employees as they pursue higher education. And I think that's a really valuable piece, and a piece that I would like to see in more social enterprises, in terms of not just supporting people through the actual job at the social enterprise, but helping to move beyond. And again, talking about credentialism and some of the barriers that people face to moving into the green economy and the workforce, that they can now have some more tools and education so that they can get those jobs. So in terms of our recommendations, again, they make more sense in the context of the paper itself. We need to continue to support entrepreneurs to start up green employment-based social enterprises, develop innovative ways to finance emerging green social enterprises, and create a green job strategy for Toronto that includes social enterprises. And again, I just want to reiterate, we're not suggesting that individuals should now be responsible for coming up with their own jobs. This obviously needs to be funded, it needs to be supported by government at the same time as they're also making money through the social enterprise itself. All right, so moving into our conclusion here. So as Toronto continues to build and move toward an increasingly green economy, we must reflect on how that economy will benefit and be inclusive of all of Toronto's communities. We've recognized that there is a prominent gap in employment outcomes between racialized and non-racialized communities across the city, and that certain communities will be excluded from meaningful participation in the green economy if we don't change our current course. A socially inclusive green economy is underpinned by decent work for all. As an important step in moving toward a green economy, Toronto must address historical forms of exclusion in the current economy. This, of course, is a task fraught with complexity, yet there are ways to achieve it when stakeholders from across the board, so private, public, and third sectors, as well as unions and communities themselves, are included as part of the solution. So we've discussed 3 interrelated tools as recommended approaches toward these ends, providing a point for critical reflection on how equity and green economy are indeed closely intertwined. We hope this paper will serve as a jumping off point for many future discussions. Thank you very much. And I should mention as well, our paper was originally scheduled to be ready for tonight. We were hoping we would have copies available. They moved it to spring 2016. Thanks.
Great. Thanks. Thank you very much, Laura. That was terrific.